The rugged south coast of Western Australia is geologically ancient and rich in both marine and terrestrial biodiversity. It's dominated by fine white sandy beaches, coastal dunes, granite headlands, limestone cliffs and over 500 islands, shoals and bommies that plunge into a sparkling Southern Ocean. The raw beauty, wide open spaces and natural environment of this region are what attract most of its population, who have learned to utilise these attributes both socially and economically. In this documentary, we'll explore the fascinating natural history of the area, the footprint modern man is leaving on the landscape, and what has been done to conserve this remarkable place. The south coast stretches across 1,000 kilometres of coastline and some of the oldest geological formations in an extremely ancient landscape. The geological history of the area extends back to the late Archean era, approximately 2.8 billion years ago. Unlike most other land masses in the world that have been subjected to relatively recent periods of glaciation, much of the West Australian landscape has been left exposed for millions of years to the effects of wind and the elements. As a result, the land here is severely eroded and weathered.
The story is of long drawn out periods between periods of quite significant change. When Australia drifted north away from Antarctica, the Earth's crust thinned until it broke at the tectonic edge, and it didn't come right back up to the full height, so there's a dip in it, and it's the top of the dip's the Ravensthorpe Ramp. The rifting process took place either side of around 160 million years ago.
During this upheaval, the continental plates overrode each other, and as the crust eroded away, the hardest parts, such as the barren ranges, were left standing.
Back during the Eocene, which is 30 to 80 million years ago, the sea levels were a lot higher. This is a long, long time ago. And the mountains behind the barrens were islands sticking up out of that ocean. And the spongylite rocks, which are all in the marine plain that lies all along the coast and is around the barrens, was an old seafloor. And a common life in that tropical ocean, as it was back then, were sea sponges that lived on the floor of the ocean.
At this time, when the ocean covered much of the present-day south coast and many of the mountain peaks were isolated islands, a diverse range of flora evolved. Descendants of these unusual plants still exist today.
Subsequently, the ice ages occurred and the water was drawn up into the ice around parts of the world and the sea levels dropped. The biggest changes were around 10 to 20,000 years ago. Most of the northern hemisphere was covered by glaciers, and the sea levels here were 85 metres lower than they are now.
It was during a period of low sea levels that the first Australians came, most likely island hopping from Southeast Asia and slowly moving southwards, finally reaching the south coast 20 to 40,000 years ago.
We know that the Aboriginal people, when they populated Australia and moved around the coastal environment, they didn't come through the centre, and hence why we're later than the western side of the south coast, because the people came down the west coast, along the south coast, and then across over towards South Australia.
Islands offshore, such as the Recherche Archipelago, were part of the mainland, with a coastline about 60 kilometres away from its present location.
These islands down here were very well used by Aboriginal people because they provided an abundance of food and wildlife, and also a lot of protection and shelter by the cavities that were created. But also the other thing is They were used as physical bearings.
Archaeological surveys have been carried out on the islands closer to today's present shoreline.
We found evidence of Aboriginal occupation on those islands. Now, archaeological research that has been carbon dated indicate that those islands were last joined about 20-odd thousand years ago. And as the sea levels rose during that period of time, that basically forced the Aboriginal people to retract.
For thousands of years, they've seasonally roamed these lands, the oldest culture and the oldest landscape.
In the southwest of Western Australia, we have what we call the Noongar Nation, and there's 14 tribes in that Noongar Nation. We're the most eastern of that tribe.
Aboriginal people have a deep spiritual connection with the landscape, and they consider themselves belonging to it, rather than it belonging to them. An ancient culture steeped in mystery.
When the white man first started sailing past here, Aboriginal people were quite amazed at these unusual looking features. They thought they were ghosts. They were reincarnated forms of ancestors gone by.
There followed a period of international exploration along the south coast, beginning with the Dutch in 1626, followed by the British and the French, who charted the coastline, naming the many bays, headlands and the islands in their own honour. They were generally unimpressed with the landscape, it being so different from what they were used to in Europe. However, they knew that Indigenous people lived on the mainland, and many early explorers were keen to make contact with them. As word spread across Europe and the Americas of the bountiful supply of marine mammals in these waters, by the early 1800s, gangs of sealers and whalers lived and worked amongst the remote bays and rugged islands.
When we had the first contact here with the French, we then were visited quite frequently by whalers and sealers along the south coast. And these guys were not only pretty notorious, they were pretty rough and rugged guys. And basically, when they were coming along the south coast and seeing the Aboriginal people, there was a lot of interaction and fighting and feuding, mainly over the women. And you know, it's not rocket science to work out, the interaction created a lot of angst and fear because they were only protecting their wives and their daughters from this invasion.
These early mariners ate Cape Barren geese and fish, occasionally making the run to Albany to sell their seal skins and stock up on supplies. But before too long, they depleted seal numbers and the bounty was no longer profitable. However, the whaling industry continued, and Albany later had its own whaling station, the last remaining in Australia, until it ceased operations in 1978. Meanwhile, many other ships were coming. There was a race to claim the south coast and establish a settlement. Although the British had claimed and named King George III Sound in 1791, they had no continuous presence there. But with the French showing an interest in establishing a settlement, the British were spurred on to stake their claim. In 1826, a party of convicts and soldiers aboard the brig Amity arrived from Sydney and planted the British flag on the mainland, becoming the first white settlement in Western Australia. Contrary to the hostile interactions with sealers and whalers, things were much more amicable between Indigenous people and the European settlers on land. Some of the Aboriginals lived in settlers' huts with them, dressed in white man's clothes, and spoke a kind of pidgin English. They were happy to shake hands plenty with their new friends, the white man. Early exploration of the inland terrain was greatly assisted by the Aboriginals, who led them along the walking trails the Noongar people had maintained for generations. Little did they know, these white folk were here to stay, and they now considered this land theirs. settlers began to travel vast distances to the region looking for arable land to plant crops and graze livestock. The old Strawberry Hill farm in Albany was the first farm in Western Australia. From 1827, it produced the state's first wheat, barley and maize crops. These pioneers did it tough, opening up large parts of the region for agriculture. After World War II, during the 1950s and 60s, the state government pushed for the clearing of 1 million acres a year. Under this short-sighted policy, large areas of marginal land that was not really suitable for broad-scale farming was opened up. By the mid-1980s, the rate of large-scale clearing had slowed, but by then about 90% of the original wheat belt vegetation had been removed. Although integral to the growth and development of the region, broad-scale land clearing has decimated habitats for native flora and fauna, and is a primary reason many species have become rare or threatened. In many cases, the process simply left too little vegetation to support viable populations of native plants and animals. The South Coast was always one of the biologically richest parts of southwestern Australia. Following the decades of clearing, it now has a higher concentration of rare, threatened or endangered flora and fauna than most other parts of Australia. This is one of the reasons it's part of the Southwest Botanical Province, one of only 34 worldwide biodiversity hotspots. Around 700 known plant species are endemic, only found along the south coast, and this high level of endemism is another reason for its hotspot listing. Groups involved in the ambitious collaboration, the Gondwana Link Partnership, have started purchasing properties to provide wildlife corridors between the remaining habitat areas. Led by Keith Bradby, they aim to reconnect across heavily cleared areas, building a more ecologically resilient landscape.
What we're basically saying is that you've got probably one big opportunity across all of southwestern Australia to get health back into the country and abundance back into the wildlife. And that's across the 1,000 kilometres from the bottom of the west coast, Margaret River area, right through to the Nullarbor, which runs from that really wet forest to that really magnificent dry woodland. Over 900 kilometres of that is bush. Most of it's pretty intact, as healthy as we've got left. And with a bit of effort, it can all be connected. We'd like to see it all functioning ecologically. It can be the pathway through which all the wildlife can move backwards and forwards as they need to. And I think it can be a great symbol of hope for all the other battered bits of Australia in the world. And indeed it has been. You know, we started off, everyone knew we were crazy, we knew we were crazy. There are now Gondwana Link-like programs happening all across Australia. There's probably been 3 or 4 big impacts on the bush of the southwest. The first one was the disruption of the Noongar pattern of management, which was, I believe, much more detailed and proactive than we give them credit for. And when we disrupted that, we blew away their burning patterns, have never been able to get back to anything there, and started to see, you know, the beginning of the end for a lot of wildlife. For a lot of the southwest, the big clearing didn't really happen until the 1950s and 1960s, incredibly recent. And because a lot of the southwest was only cleared in the last 50 years, we're not seeing the full impacts of that yet. So we're in a position where by connecting up quickly, we will keep those populations in most areas.
The The Gondwana Link Alliance works closely with many environmental restoration groups and individuals, as well as farmers, who've seen their properties degrading as a result of overclearing, to carry out revegetation of native plants and restore health to the bush.
I think one important element of our work is that we're not trying to create some 1,000-kilometre long national park. It's got to be a working landscape. It's got to be a landscape that's got farmers in it, it's got miners in it, it's got plantation growers in it, and so on. And we've worked with all of those industries wherever we can to work out what a right balance is in a landscape. The important work is the intense local small-scale stuff that happens. The work that one group's doing between the Porongurups and the Stirlings, another group's doing between the Stirlings and the Fitzgerald. And every group that we're working with has achieved significant progress in keeping in place some of the local endemic stuff that we would have otherwise lost.
Although a vast undertaking, the program is achieving inspiring outcomes through reduced soil salinity, erosion and habitat damage, with some significant increases in populations of key wildlife and endemic plants.
You can go back to places which were just going downhill at a pretty fast rate of knots and are now flourishing bits of bush with stable soil, good bushy ground cover, trees up above your head, birds everywhere. And then when Bush Heritage and the other guys do their monitoring programs, you discover the pygmy possum have moved in and the black glove wallabies have been feeding there since year 3 or so on.
The world is in the middle of a major extinction event, arguably the most severe since the dinosaurs disappeared 65 million years ago. The major difference is that modern extinctions are caused by humans and are happening so fast in evolutionary terms that whole systems are also collapsing. On the south coast, 12 species of mammals and 2 bird subspecies are presumed extinct since European settlement. Climate change is now adding further stress to those vulnerable species, hanging on in the fragmented landscape.
I've got a house in town, it's got an insurance policy. I've got a big bit of bush across southwestern Australia, we're trying to build the insurance policy. And it's not a very expensive exercise compared to what we would stand to lose if we don't. It's all under a lot of stress now. Climate change is just going to accelerate all those stresses. So connected, healthy, and loved.
Thanks to the foresight of individuals in the past, large areas along the south coast have been set aside as national parks or reserves. The Department of Parks and Wildlife, or DPAW, manage these areas for wildlife conservation, scientific study and public enjoyment. These incredible landscapes and ecosystems that support our much-loved biodiversity are also fundamental to the tourism industry and local economy. With around 18 million hectares to manage, the regional leader for nature conservation, Dion Utber and his team, have a big job.
The resources that need particular attention through the work that we do are the flora and the fauna and the landscapes and habitats in which they exist, and then also the ecological processes that underpin their survival. The South Coast is fairly significant because of the flora and the fauna and the uniqueness and diversity that we have, and that really extends out through the southwest of Western Australia, which in international terms is a global biodiversity hotspot. So there's 34 named biodiversity hotspots, and the southwest is one of those. And then within the southwest, the south coast stands out in particular for its high levels of diversity, plant diversity in particular, and also high levels of endemism. And this is a great position to be in, to be one of the jewels in the crown of the Southwest Biodiversity Hotspot. I think one of the greatest threats to biodiversity on the South Coast is Phytophthora dieback. It's very difficult to know where it is until it's actually in that environment. It's spread by people, and so it can be moved through the environment quite fast. And once it gets into an area, it's almost impossible, if not impossible, to remove. Probably the best deterrent of introducing dieback is to avoid the movement of soil into an area, and during dry soil conditions the risk of that movement is minimal. As soon as the environment and soil starts getting wet, it adheres to cars, to boots, to equipment, and it is easily moved, and the disease moves with it. We're working closely with organisations such as South Coast NRM and local community groups to try and promote the awareness of dieback, encourage people to be clean in the environment when they're driving around in it, not to go spreading mud around and potentially dieback into our pristine and highly valued coastal areas. Some of the national parks that stand out on the south coast include the Stirling Range National Park, the Fitzgerald River National Park, and even Cape Harrod National Park. The Stirlings has over 1,500 plant species. It's one of the few montane areas in the southwest, with peaks up to 1,000 metres high. Likewise, the Fitzgerald River National Park also has montane environments, but it has a wide diversity of environments within the national park. It's just under 300,000 hectares. It's probably the single largest national park in the southwest of Western Australia, and because of its size, it has this intactness, it has its diversity of landscape and habitat. It's been recognised internationally as a UNESCO biosphere.
UNESCO, or the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation, designated the Fitzgerald River Biosphere Reserve in 1978, and it's one of only 2 such reserves in Western Australia. Biosphere reserves are areas where man's sustainable interaction with nature can be measured, researched, implemented and celebrated.
And then Cape Harrod National Park over in the east, which then extends out into the Northland Nature Reserve, is also significant because it's a large coastal area that's intact. It's one of the 2 remaining areas where the western ground parrot is still in existence, and it's a critically endangered parrot.
Nearly 3/4 of Western Australia's threatened terrestrial birds and 29% of threatened terrestrial mammals occur along the south coast. DPAW's regional ecologist Sarah Comer works closely with a team of scientists and community volunteers to implement recovery plans for a range of threatened species.
We're out here doing a number of jobs that are related to understanding how effective our management of the reserve is for fauna, and we have 2 sites set up out in the park with a series of different trap types, and they're monitored every spring and autumn. Out in Cape Harrod, we've been catching things like the southern brown bandicoot, and we've certainly seen good numbers of those this week.
And she's got a pinky. Now this is special, somebody attached to the nipple.
Working with cute marsupials might seem like a dream job, but there are dangers involved.
We've got a Dunot. Wow. Yeah, they bite us. Ha ha! Ha ha! He's on. Yeah, that's a Dunot for you. You need to let go now. Come on. I don't want to hurt you. Oh, okay.
Here's 20.
We catch the native bush rat, the small native rodent, and then we've been getting honey possums.
Honey possums have a specialised brush-tipped tongue to lick nectar from the flowers they solely survive on, so a high variety of flowering plants are particularly important to them. One of the greatest impacts on native animals is predation by introduced species, in particular the European fox and feral cat.
We're also radio tracking and trying to retrieve some of the collars that we had on feral cats. We baited the park using the Eradicate cat baits in March, so now we're looking for the GPS collars that were on the feral cats that we collared in January. This work that we're doing down here is the first